My name is Thelina. I grew up in a small lakeside town in Vermont, where winters seemed to stretch forever and everyone knew each other's business. On the surface, my childhood appeared ordinary, even idyllic. My father, Richard, was a high school physics teacher, and my mother, Clara, worked night shifts as a nurse at the county hospital. We weren't rich, but we never had to worry about where the next meal would come from. I used to be the only child, and for a fleeting time, I was loved in the way every child deserves to be. Each morning, my mother would gently brush my hair before work, her hands warm and calm. On weekends, my father took me fishing by the lake, teaching me the difference between perch and bass and how to tie fishing knots that wouldn't tangle. On summer nights, the three of us would sit on the porch, sharing ice cream and listening to cicadas hum into the warm darkness. I believed that was what a family was meant to feel like, soft, steady, and comforting, like the ticking of an old wall clock. But it all ended on a freezing January night, not long after my 8th birthday. I was awakened by frantic knocking and the piercing headlights of a car shining through the curtains. My aunt, Helen, stepped into our house, her face pale and voice trembling. "Your mom's at the hospital," she said. "Your little sister came early. She needs special care." I didn't grasp the full meaning of her words. I only understood that from that moment forward, everything would change. My baby's sister, Celeste, was born at 32 weeks, a tiny reddish bundle cocooned in an incubator surrounded by tubes and machines. I wasn't allowed to get close. "We can't risk her getting sick," my mother said, eyes glued to the heart monitor. When I reached out to touch her hand, she brushed me away, gently but decisively, as if I too was a threat. When Celeste came home, our familiar house transformed into something sterile and distant. The kitchen reeked of bleach, air purifiers buzzed 24/7, and hand sanitizers stood like sentinels in every room. If I so much as sneezed, I'd be sent to Grandma Nora's for the week. At first, I thought it was a reward. Grandma made the best chocolate chip cookies and always had a new fairy tale book for me. But slowly I realized I wasn't being spoiled. I was being exiled. Every time I tried to shine, bringing home perfect test scores, taping drawings to the fridge, sharing stories from school, my efforts were met with distracted nods. My mother would ask if we had tissues because Celeste seemed a little sniffly. My father would mutter, "Good job," without even glancing up. No hugs. No smiles, no pride. That's when I began to understand. I wasn't the center anymore. I was the silence, the one who must not disrupt. Celeste was the light they all saw. I slowly learned how to be silent in my own home. I stopped bringing home perfect tests. I no longer taped watercolor drawings to the fridge. I once believed that if I tried hard enough, my parents would once again see me, the Thelina I used to be before Celeste arrived. But no matter what I did, no matter how well I performed, I couldn't pull their eyes away from my little sister. I got a perfect score on my 3rd grade math test, something I'd worked weeks for. I walked in holding that paper, heart pounding with hope. My mother glanced at it, then immediately turned to my father. "Did you remember to buy tissues?" "Celeste is stuffy again." And my father simply said, "Good job, sweetie," without even a smile or a hug. When was the last time I was hugged for something good? I couldn't remember, so I tried other ways. I painted watercolors, landscapes, portraits, even one of Celeste sleeping. I won 1st place at the school science fair. I devoured books just to find one interesting fact to share with Mom. But every time I opened my mouth, the reply was always the same. "Celeste is napping, don't be loud," or "She has a fever, go play outside." I began to realize all my efforts were like knocking on a door no one stood behind. My bedroom became the only place I could truly be myself. I kept the door shut, lit peppermint-scented candles, the only scent that irritated Celeste, so she was never allowed in. That little room became my sanctuary, where I dove into art history, ancient civilizations, and the stories behind every weathered painting I could find. What hurt more than silence was when my parents began rewriting the past. Whenever someone asked about me, my mother would say, "Talina's always been strong and independent. She understands that Celeste needs more care." I just smiled tightly. I never understood. I simply learned to live without being seen. Eventually, I became the one who didn't need attention. Not because I didn't crave love, but because they decided I could survive without it. I was just 10 when I overheard Mom telling the neighbor I'd been self-sufficient since she was little. I stood there holding a heavy book, wondering, when did I become invisible? I decided to get a job, not for money, but for a place where someone might see me as a real person. In 8th grade, I applied to work at Sugar Pines Bakery, the one that smelled like butter and warmth from blocks away. The owner, Mrs. Lorraine, didn't ask why a 13-year-old wanted to mop floors. She simply placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "If you work hard, you deserve a place in the world." It was the first time someone believed in me without conditions. Every afternoon after school, I tied up my hair, put on an apron, and began wiping tables, washing trays, and serving pastries. At home, I did homework quietly at my tiny desk. No one asked where I'd been, as long as Celeste didn't smell hand soap on me. Celeste never had to work, never had to clean, never stepped into that bakery unless she was picking out a birthday cake. Yet every school event, every church recital she had, the whole family showed up with flowers and cameras. Me? When I scored perfectly on the SAT, Mom just muttered, "That's nice," as she sliced oranges for Celeste, who needed more vitamin C. I applied to 12 colleges without telling anyone. I wrote my essays on bakery breaks and had Mrs. Lorraine review them. I filled out the FAFSA forms alone and calculated every cent I needed to afford a bus ticket for a scholarship interview out of state. Every step I took, I walked alone, quietly, steadily, with just one small hope. One day, I would no longer be invisible. I left the small town in Vermont in silence. No farewells, no warm hugs, no proud glances from anyone in my family. As the night bus sped past the shadowy pine trees, I clutched my worn backpack. Inside were a few sets of clothes, an old notebook, and a folded piece of paper, my acceptance letter to Columbia University with a full scholarship. I hadn't told anyone at home, not because I wanted to keep it a secret, but because I knew they wouldn't care. In New York, I started from zero. The dorm was tiny, the cafeteria food bland, the nights long and cold, but I had never felt lighter. Here, no one called me Celeste's sister. No one looked at me with pity or indifference. I was just me, Talina, majoring in art history. I studied relentlessly, not only because I loved it, but because I knew this was my only way out. I spent hours in the library researching Baroque styles, Edwardian jewelry, and the hidden meanings behind antique pieces. I didn't dream of fame. I just wanted to be good enough, so no one would ever dismiss me again. In my second year, I applied for an unpaid internship at a small jewelry appraisal firm in Brooklyn. The job demanded excruciating detail. White gloves, magnifying lenses, cross-referencing auction records from the 18th century. I wasn't paid, but I was learning, and that was priceless. One autumn afternoon, while sorting a batch of vintage hairpins, a small silver clip caught my eye. It had been miscategorized as costume jewelry, but something about it held me. The fine engraving, flawless enamel, and a nearly erased maker's mark. I couldn't look away. I spent the entire night researching. That symbol belonged to a French artisan who once crafted for royalty before World War I. I presented my findings during our weekly meeting. At first, no one noticed. But as I laid out archival documents, side-by-side sketches, and museum records, the room grew still. The hairpin was reappraised and later auctioned for over $40,000. For the first time, my name appeared in the internal company email. "Talina has a sharp eye." I didn't celebrate. I just kept working, carefully, quietly, never skipping a step. Day after day, more undervalued pieces began to land on my desk. Coincidence? Maybe not. I was entrusted with larger collections. Once, it was a cloisonné necklace assumed to be fake. It turned out to be an original from a 19th century Russian atelier. Another time, a platinum wedding ring dismissed as generic. It was one of 30 made for a historic Boston family's anniversary. Then came a June afternoon. My supervisor, Margaret, invited me to lunch. As she sliced into her tart, she asked, "Talina, have you ever thought of starting your own firm?" I burst into laughter. Me? The girl who worked for free for 2 years and survives on instant noodles? She smiled. Exactly. That's why you'll make it. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning. I started accepting small verification jobs, pawn shops, family antique stores, places that couldn't afford the big firms. I charged modestly, worked patiently, and never cut corners. Every item I touched, I searched for the hidden value, just as I once wished someone would see in me. At 27, I officially founded my own company, a small 25-square-meter office on the 3rd floor of an old building in Chicago, right next to an Italian cafe. I named it Iris and Veil. Iris, for the flower my mother once grew before Celeste was born, and Veil, for the valley I had crossed, alone. The early days at Iris and Veil were anything but glamorous. I worked nearly 12 hours a day, juggling appraisals, paperwork, floor cleaning, and tea serving. My wooden desk was propped up by a stack of books, and my chair creaked every time I leaned. Every night I'd ask myself, does anyone believe in me besides me? But clients started returning, perhaps because I was obsessively meticulous, or maybe because I always explained every detail clearly, never cutting corners. An elderly woman brought in her wedding ring from the Great Depression. A man wanted to verify his late mother's pearl necklace. I handled each case with the highest care, treating every item as a precious memory to be preserved. Word began to spread. I got a call from a lawyer handling estate assets, then from a regional museum. They needed someone to appraise an untouched vintage jewelry collection. I had no assistant then, so I did everything myself, with a magnifying glass, halogen lighting, and the instinct I'd honed for years. In the second year, I moved to a larger office, a glass-fronted space with a new sign, still near the old cafe. I hired my first employee, Maya, a recent graduate in mineralogy with bright eyes and rare patience. I taught her how to examine gemstone cuts under warm light, how to spot signs of handcrafting, and most importantly, how to trust her intuition. We worked quietly, but the pace of growth surprised me. From small side jobs, my company began landing contracts worth hundreds of thousands, appraising safe box heirlooms, forgotten collections, even pieces once owned by European aristocrats. By the 5th year, Iris and Veil had 3 branches in Chicago, Denver, and Minneapolis. We worked with international auction houses, museums, and even renowned fashion designers. My personal net worth surpassed $12 million, not counting nearly $1 million more in pending contracts. But no one in my family knew. I still attended Sunday dinners, listening to my mother talk about how Celeste had switched majors for the 4th time, this time to animal behavior psychology. My father asked if I had considered applying to the local high school. The insurance is good. Celeste scrolled through Instagram, showing off a discounted designer bag, which I knew was a limited edition, never on sale. Whenever they asked what I was doing, I simply smiled. Same old antique jewelry work. No one asked further. No one noticed that the pearl necklace I wore once belonged to a British countess. I didn't say anything, because sometimes silence is the only crown the overlooked are allowed to wear, without needing permission. I began sending money to my parents, $3,000 a month, then $5,000, then $7,000. When Celeste suddenly needed tuition for her new interior design program, coincidentally, a dream I once had, my mother called, her voice cautious. "Your father's salary isn't enough. Could you help?" I didn't ask why. I just set up an automatic transfer. I didn't do it because they deserved it. I did it because I could. Not everyone gets that chance. Thanksgiving dinner turns into a nightmare. When the truth is unveiled, Thelina hadn't returned home for 3 years since leaving the small town in Vermont. This Thanksgiving, she decided to come back, hoping to mend relationships with her family after years of separation. However, she didn't anticipate that the family dinner would turn into a nightmare, where dark secrets would be unveiled and painful truths would come to light. Thelina's family consisted of her parents, grandparents, and 2 younger brothers, Marcus and Daniel. Her mother, Eleanor, was a traditional woman who always aimed to maintain the image of a perfect family. Her father, Richard, was strict, reserved, but held significant influence in the household. Marcus, the eldest brother, was married to a woman named Olivia, while Daniel was still in college. As Thelina entered the house, she sensed a tense atmosphere. Everyone greeted her with forced smiles, and she quickly realized something was amiss. Throughout dinner, minor stories became the cause of heated arguments. Her mother criticized her attire, while her father repeatedly mentioned her past failures. The tension peaked when Thelina accidentally discovered a letter in her father's study. The letter revealed that Marcus had embezzled money from the family company to invest in a failed project. Worse, her parents had known about this but chose to remain silent to protect the family's reputation. Feeling betrayed, Thelina decided to confront the family during dessert. She stood up, held the letter, and read it aloud in front of everyone. The room's atmosphere grew heavy, and silence enveloped the space. Marcus tried to justify his actions, but his words only worsened the situation. Her mother, Eleanor, attempted to quell the argument by asking everyone to stay silent to protect the family's reputation. However, Thelina couldn't accept the truth being concealed. She decided to leave the house, taking the letter as evidence of the truth. After leaving, Thelina contacted a local journalist and provided information about the incident. The story quickly spread, and the family company faced an investigation from authorities. Marcus was charged with embezzlement, and her parents had to face the consequences of concealing the truth. Although Thelina's actions caused the family to fall apart, she felt relieved for unveiling the truth. She realized that sometimes, to seek justice and truth, one must confront pain and make sacrifices. After that Thanksgiving dinner filled with tension and tears, I didn't look back. No one said sorry. No one hugged me goodbye. I walked out of the house that was once my home like the last guest leaving an unwanted party, uninvited, unmissed. That night, I returned to my apartment in Chicago, switched off my phone, and placed it face down on the table, as if that could silence the storm brewing. Messages flooded in, from my mother, my father, Celeste, even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in over a decade. Some accused me of being selfish. Others blamed me for tearing the family apart. A few wrote lengthy monologues demanding I remember my blood ties. I once wished to be noticed, but now that I was, it came in the form of demands, entitlement, and greed, not love. I hired a lawyer, Marcus, who had represented one of my VIP clients in an estate dispute. When I showed him the web of messages, he nodded calmly and said, "We'll clean this up." Legally and emotionally. Within a week, we issued cease and desist letters to every sender, demanding they halt harassment, threats, or financial requests. I asked Marcus to include one simple sentence in plain language at the end. If love exists, it should never come with an invoice. I changed all my phone numbers, scrubbed my personal information from the company system, even instructed my receptionist not to allow anyone claiming to be family inside without an appointment. There was only one person I didn't block, my grandmother. She had always seen me, truly seen me, even when the world only spun around Celeste. When I called and told her everything, she wasn't surprised. She just sighed and said, "You finally did what you should have done a long time ago." I invited her to stay with me for a few weeks. She arrived with a small suitcase and a tin of butter cookies she baked herself. Each night, we sat side by side, sorting through vintage jewelry newly acquired from Switzerland. Two old souls, quiet and connected without needing to speak much. I realized, family isn't blood. Family is where you're allowed to be your full self without explanation. I relocated my company to a new headquarters, inside a secure complex with biometric access and AI-integrated surveillance. My new office had a soft leather chair, an amber desk lamp, and a mahogany bookshelf I bought from a closing bookstore. The scent of wood, the light, the quiet. They made me feel like I was finally living in my full size, no longer shrinking myself to fit into anyone else's comfort. I no longer attended Sunday dinners. No more surprise calls that always ended with, "Celeste is short on tuition again." No more half smiles from my mother saying, "She lives frugally, eats canned food most days." No more side glances when I walked in wearing a bracelet once owned by a Russian queen. I no longer needed them to validate my success. I didn't need anyone to recognize my worth because I had already redefined it myself. Family, I finally understood, isn't the people who ask you to dim so they can shine. Family is where you're allowed to glow, and no one tries to put out your light. After everything, I could finally breathe deeply without feeling crushed by expectations, judgment, or old wounds. My life, at last, belonged solely to me. Iris and Vale was no longer a tiny tucked-away office in a modest neighborhood. After 5 years of quiet but steady growth, I had expanded it into 3 flagship locations in Chicago, Denver, and Minneapolis. We didn't just appraise vintage jewelry anymore. We partnered with major museums, high-end fashion houses, and even consulted for historical films on antique jewelry recreation. Each day, I stepped into the main headquarters, a modern yet warm space where sunlight streamed through massive glass windows and danced on the surfaces of pieces awaiting appraisal. Maya, now our director of expertise, and I led a team of over 20 people, each driven by a fierce love for forgotten beauty. I no longer had to prove my worth. I didn't need to perform to be recognized. I simply lived, like someone who had once been invisible but never doubted her value. A renowned fashion designer invited me to appraise her entire antique jewelry collection for a solo exhibition in New York. Then came an invitation from the European Museum of History to help restore an 18th century treasure lost during wartime. Projects I had once only dreamed of now came seeking me. I still lived in a modest mid-century style home by Lake Menard, just outside Madison. Each morning, I brewed black tea, sat by the second-story window, and watched the mist roll across the water, feeling as light as the air. My grandmother still lived with me. She always said, as long as we don't get in each other's way, age is no barrier to joy. One evening, as we sorted gemstones for the Swiss collection, she asked me softly, "What are you most proud of?" I thought for a moment, then smiled. That I never lost myself, even when the cost was steep. I no longer needed the kind of family love that demanded obedience, sacrifice, or silence. I rebuilt my life from shattered pieces, but this time, every piece was held together by strength and self-respect. One early morning, I rediscovered the lavender swan hairpin my grandmother used to keep in her old wooden box. I placed it in a blue velvet case and wrote one line on a card. For the girl who once felt invisible, you became the kind of light no one saw coming. That box now sits proudly on the first shelf of my private gallery. Not for sale, not for display. Just a quiet reminder that my journey didn't begin with privilege. It began with being overlooked. Perhaps my journey isn't so different from that of a forgotten gemstone, buried deep in dust and silence, overlooked, doubted, unseen. But what gives a stone its true worth isn't where it's found. It's how it reflects the light that touches it. I was once the invisible girl in my own family. Every step I took was unseen. Every victory I earned came without applause. But now I understand. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't proving your worth to others. It's living your truth even when no one else acknowledges it. I don't resent them anymore. The neglect, the indifference, the condescension, they were all trials that showed me what I needed and what I truly deserved. Once, I tried desperately to belong to them. Today, I choose to belong to myself. No permission required, no mold to fit. My grandmother once said, "True strength isn't needing no one. It's loving yourself even when no one stands beside you." I think of the thousands of others out there, children constantly compared, daughters seen as less important, people labeled independent, just so no one has to care for them. I wrote my story not to boast, but to tell them this: you don't need anyone's permission to shine. You can start from nothing. You can be forgotten, scarred, romanticized as the strong one while silently breaking inside. But if you don't give up on yourself, you will find light. A light that comes from within, not from validation. I used to think revenge meant making them regret. But in the end, the sweetest revenge was living a life where no one could ever make me feel small again. I didn't need to shout that I'd succeeded. Just being happy, that was enough. I no longer need validation from my parents. I don't need Celeste to apologize. I don't need anyone to admit I was worthy of love, because I've already learned how to love myself, and no one can take that away. In my gallery, among priceless gems, sits a special shelf, not with diamonds or rubies, but an old swan-shaped hairpin. It rests in a velvet blue case, beside a handwritten card that reads, "For the girl who once thought she wasn't enough. You don't need to shine. You only need to be real." I keep it there, not for praise, but for me. For the days when I grow tired, so I can look at it and remember I was once lost, but I found my way back, stronger, freer, and fuller in heart. that is the most beautiful revenge. Not to hurt anyone, but to heal yourself.